Say my name. I am awake. I am the danger. I am the one who knocks.
Welcome once again to Breaking into Breaking Bad with Clifford and Caleb Humphrey. Welcome to Season 4. It's good to be here. Today we discuss the first episode of Season 4 called Box Cutter. This is a gruesome episode. Capes, you want to remind us what happens in this episode for those of us who maybe haven't seen it recently?
Yeah. I'll explain why this episode was so gruesome. If you recall the finale of season 3, you see Jesse pointing a gun at Gale Bedecker, and then it goes black, and then you hear a gun go off. And unfortunately, in this episode, we do see that Jesse did pull the trigger and kill Gale Bedecker, which left him in pretty much a look of shock through about 90% of the whole episode after that happened. But the main thing with this episode was Walt was basically just trying everything in his mind to convince Gus that he needs to be kept alive, him and Jesse. And so they're brought down into the lab. They had to wait this whole time for Gus to show up. When Gus does show up, he does a very weird, he doesn't even say a word. He just comes in, changes into a lab coat, and ends up cutting the throat of Victor, which was his own employee, which when I first saw this, I thought that was very strange, but we can get into why all that happened a little bit later in the episode. But that was a pretty heavy part. And we also see Hank still trying to get better, and it looks like he picked up a new hobby with some rocks or minerals. And you also see Skyler dealing with the whole situation with her not really knowing what happened to Walt when he disappeared. So it was a lot of going on, but most of it was Walt just kind of begging for his life and trying to negotiate the best he could.
Thanks, Cabes. The title of this episode is Box Cutter, and it's pretty clear why. The introduction shows, we can kind of go into it a little bit here. So the introduction is Gale setting up the lab, ordering all the equipment, and he uses a box cutter to open the packages and set up all the equipment. And a couple different times the camera focuses on the box cutter. And then later on in the episode, when Gus kills Victor, he does so with the same box cutter. I don't know if there's supposed to be a sense of irony or justice there, or what. Like the same box cutter that with which Gale sets up the lab is the one that Gale uses or Gus uses to kill Victor. I don't really see a deep connection there. Maybe it is, and I don't see it. But for what it's worth, the box cutter is focused on a couple times, so that's kind of what it's going. The only other thing to say about the intro, I think, is that there's a question that comes up. So we see Gus asking Gale, "Hey, how's the lab setting up, going? And how soon do you think we can be in operation?" And he shows Gale a sample of the blue meth and has him analyze it. And Gale recognizes expertise. And he says, whoever made that meth was really, really good. He says, that's 99% pure. He says, I can get probably to 96. I couldn't get to 99. He says, that whoever made that, now that's the real, if that's the competition, then we're in trouble. And Gus says, oh, that's not competition. Don't worry about it. And Gale says, oh, I think we should try and contact that person. That should be the guy that runs the lab. And then Gus says to Gale about Walt, I don't consider him a professional, which leads me to think he does consider Gale a professional, even though Gale's not as good at chemistry. And Gus says, hey, we don't need 99%, like 96 is good enough. And Gale's like, no, you don't understand. That 3% actually matters a whole lot. Like, there's a big difference between 96 and 99. And that's all we know. Then it flashes, to the present moment. But I'm left wondering, wait a minute, does that mean that Gus really never intended on using Walt for the lab? Like, he always intended on having Gus be the guy who runs the lab?
Yeah, I think so. Honestly, we don't know from Breaking Bad what kind of relationship that Gale and Gus had and how long they've known each other. But Gale pretty much talked Gus into going after Walt.
Right.
He was coming up with, like, oh no, you'll do just fine. But Gus Walt Gale was not showing really any bravery or, hey, don't worry, thank you for putting your trust in me, I got this. He was just zero confidence. He was all about that extra 3%, and that this guy is, I think he was more intrigued on the chemistry part of it. Like, how did he get to that extra 3%? I have to know.
Right. Yeah. No, he respects the chemistry for sure.
That he does.
Yeah. Well, okay. So if knowing that now, we can think back on how things went with Walt and Gale, and we remember, okay, oh, interesting. So Walt owes Gale for his job.
Yeah.
And when he was hired for $3 million for 3 months, we don't know how much Gus was getting.
Gale.
But we don't know how much Gale was getting, yeah. But we're pretty sure it's less than that. And then we remember, oh, shoot, Walt fires Gale. So Gale gets Walt the job, and then Walt fires Gale. I mean, if you think about, like, that sucks for Gale, right? I mean, he was the guy who, he could have told Walt, hey, like, Gus wanted me and I could have done it, but I couldn't have done it as good as you. And, I'm so glad that you're here. And he could have signaled to him in a way that he was there because Gale wanted him there, because Gale respected him and respected the chemistry so much. And then that would have really changed the balance of power when Walt feels absolutely free to fire Gale. So that makes a kind of injustice out of it, where Walt prefers Jesse over Gale. Not only is it kind of unfair because just on paper, Jesse is not as good as Gale, right? Like, that's true. But even more than that, Walt owes his very job to Gale. So it was really sucky of him to treat Gale the way that he did. And then what happens to Gale at the end? Jesse kills him. So the context that we're given there changes the way we look back on the whole dynamic between the three of them.
Yeah, I mean, it was such a sad death. It's probably one of the saddest deaths we've seen thus far, just because there was nobody that hated Gale, right? He was a very awkward character, but, like, he was great.
And he was kind of likable. Yeah.
He's very likable. So it was sad to see him go, but I'm sure we'll get into this. But, Walt even says, like, when you make it Gale versus me, it's always going to be me. So
yeah, right. Yeah, it's sad because, unlike the situation with Walt and Crazy 8, Walt was confident that Crazy 8 was going to kill him, and therefore it was an act of self-defense.
Yep.
Now we know that somebody was going to try and kill Walt so that Gale could take his place, but we know it was going to be Mike. And so Gale really posed no direct danger, except that his existence was an indirect threat to Walt. And as Walt said, when you make it Walt versus Gale, Walt wins every time, or Gale loses every time. Okay, well, let's move on. So anyway, interesting questions that the introduction bring up. So we learned that Jesse did in fact shoot Gale, and I think this was Jesse's first murder. Am I right? Has Jesse ever directly killed anyone? We know he shot Tuco, but that wasn't the death shot, right? Hank takes the death shot for Tuco.
think you're right.
And as you said, for like 90% of the episode, Jesse's kind of distraught by what he had to do. And he was in a position where he owed Walt his life because Walt saved him. And so he was caught in a tragic position where he owes it to Walt to save his life. And justice requires that. And on the other hand, the only way he could fulfill that justice was by committing an injustice against Gale. And that's just a sucky place to be.
And he wasn't given much time to really think this out.
No.
You know, right? Like remember Walt, he wrote a whole pros and cons list when dealing with Crazy 8.
Mm-hmm.
But Jesse was given, you have a 20-minute head start. You better leave now.
Okay, well, we'll just note that was Jesse's real first murder, and we sympathize with Jesse that he was in like I said, a tragic position where there's no good way out of that. You know, if he had not done that, it would have led to Walt's death, and that would have been an injustice as well. And so there was no way for Jesse to get out of that situation, unfortunately.
Right.
I don't know if it's a big deal, but I was noticing the camera focuses in Gale's apartment on the tea kettle with the hole in it.
Mm-hmm.
It's still on the stovetop and it's dripping, and it's an interesting, camera effect there. But weird that the bullet didn't go through. Just goes through one side. It doesn't knock. It doesn't knock it off the stove. That's weird, right? Like you'd think if it would have hit it, it would have either gone all the way through or knocked it over. Instead, presumably the bullet's still in the tea kettle. I mean, it's just weird. I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess we didn't see an exit on the tea kettle.
So. Yeah, but it's dripping on that one side. That's all we know.
Yeah.
Okay, so Jesse's dealing with the trauma of having shot Gale, and so he's just sitting there in the car when Victor comes and finds him, and he's kind of pathetic. Like he's just a sitting duck. And Victor picks him up. I'm surprised Victor didn't just shoot him and then go back and tell Gus. It was too late, but it's okay. I exacted revenge. I did the ruthless thing that we do,
Right.
And instead, that kind of led to his own death in a way.
It's strange because was Jesse sitting in his car because of the shock? Or was this kind of part of the plan? Like, hey, you did what you had to do, but this is the only way back in is to be caught almost. That might be too much, but I think mostly it was the shock. I don't think so. Yeah, I think it was the shock that took over.
I think it would have given Walt more leverage if he'd have said, "Hey, Jesse's still out there," and I don't know. And to me, if you look at his face when he's sitting in the car, he looks like he was just incapacitated, like he couldn't do anything. He was just traumatized.
Right.
But think about it. That was really dumb. Like he just committed a murder. Police are on the way and he's just sitting there. You think they would have, like, if the police had come, they would have pulled him out and said, "Sir, there's just a shooting here. Did you see anywhere I need to question you? Tell us what you saw." I mean, it's just dumb. Like, what are you doing? So
yeah, it's definitely a shock play.
Okay. So that's what Jesse's doing. So Walt's car is still at his home when Skyler wakes up. This was kind of humorous. Skyler doesn't realize it, and Marie comes back and says, "Hey, I see Walt stayed tonight," and I'm wondering, like, why is Skyler so interested to disabuse people, her like move the car out of the way so nobody asks questions? Like, are there a lot of people who really care, who are really going to notice besides Marie?
Well, she says later in the episode that she didn't want Walt Jr. to see the car and then be confused, which I get, but I'm wondering what Skyler was thinking. Like, she didn't call the cops or anything like that. She automatically knew something was not right. It was not good.
No, right. Well, okay, so that's interesting. So there's two things to be concerned about. One is, oh my gosh, I don't want Walter Jr. to wake up and him to think that dad spent the night and mom and dad slept together and their relationship must be better now. She's concerned that he doesn't draw that conclusion. She's like, oh my gosh, I don't want him to think that Walt stayed the night.
Right.
She's also concerned, oh no, like Walt's missing. Like what the heck happened to Walt? Maybe I should call the cops, right? Which one is she more concerned about?
Well, let's see. She calls. It's Walt, honestly, because she calls Saul, trying to figure out what was going on frantically, right?
Okay, so she calls Saul, she calls the locksmith guy and has that whole comical
Right.
story to get into his apartment, which yields nothing and is a lot of effort, and it's a big production on her part. But driving the car a couple blocks down the road, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but it seems to me she's more concerned about Walter Jr. thinking, or anybody else thinking, that maybe Walt and Skyler are patching things up. Because you remember that conversation that Walt and Skyler have when they're like, well, what are we going to tell people? And how many times can I come over? And she's like, well, once a week. And he's like, no, twice a week. And they're like, and he says, well, what if she's like, well, I'll just say that my husband is estranged and is desperate to get back. And Walt's like, well, what if he's not no longer estranged and he actually is back? She's like, you're in fairy tale land. Like, you're dreaming. That's never going to happen. She is so determined to keep the power balance between, to keep the leverage of power against Walt. And what the last thing she wants is to lose that. And if Walter Jr. thinks and Marie thinks, oh, you guys are patching things up, like you must be trusting Walt more and more now. To me, that's what she's more concerned about.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. She was just she just had this drive the whole episode on trying to find out what happened to Walt. She was just very, very curious the whole time. So,
well, yeah, I was wondering about that. So on one hand, she is like, she's calling Saul. She does that whole crazy bit with the locksmith. She gets into his apartment, and then on the other hand, nothing. Like, after that, she stops. She doesn't find anything in his apartment that leads her to the lab or anything like that. All we know is he comes back very nonchalantly, and she's like, "Oh, hey, so your car's over there." I didn't want Junior to sit. It's weird. Like, she ends the search.
Yeah.
Compare that with when he was gone last time in the desert, and she's frantic.
Yeah, a little different.
Yeah, right. I'll say. So I thought it was comical the way that Saul is acting. So Saul is really paranoid.
Big time.
And I was trying to think, what's he afraid of? And I guess he's afraid of Mike, right? Because Mike is going to find out that the address that Saul gave him to find Jesse in Virginia was not actually where he is. And then I guess Saul's afraid Mike is going to come back and like fold him in half or whatever. And so what's he doing? He's calling from a payphone, which is hilarious. It's 2010 when this was made or something?
Mm-hmm. 2008.
2008. It's like maybe there was still a payphone around. And then he's holding it with a rag, which maybe is because he's afraid it's like dirty, but he might also be afraid of leaving fingerprints. Like, I think he's just super paranoid.
Oh, like over the top. The security, he's tearing his whole office apart looking for bugs.
Right. Yeah, he's very afraid of Mike, and maybe he has very good reason to be afraid of Mike.
Yeah, I mean, he was even asking his security guard if he had a passport or not.
Yeah, right. Like, we're going to be leaving the country, and I need you to go with me. Yeah. Okay, well, maybe that's meant to reveal something both about Saul and about Mike. We'll just leave it with whatever that's suggesting. Yeah. Okay, so Victor's an interesting guy. He seems to be kind of quiet and unassuming, not really ambitious, kind of just does what he's told.
Good soldier.
And then here, good soldier. And then here we see when Walt is freaking out about, hey, I don't want to upset Gus. We really need to start doing the cook. It's 10 o'clock. We're going to lose a batch today if we don't get going. And Victor does the thing. Victor starts making meth. And Walt is watching and waiting for him to make a mistake, and he doesn't make a mistake. He's following the recipe. Walt tries to embarrass him by proving that he doesn't actually understand any of the chemistry. But Victor's kind of like, yeah, bro, it's just on one level, it's just a recipe. I don't have to understand or know the names of any of it, but I know you put a little bit of this, a pound of that, a bag of this, you mix it in here, you turn this on. And I don't know, I was kind of impressed.
Yeah. What does he say? He's going to forget the aluminum. Just watch this.
Just watch.
Guaranteed he's going to forget the aluminum.
And he almost does. And then he does.
Yeah, he almost does, but he remembers it all.
Yeah, super impressive. And now we're thinking, okay, so they really can shoot Walt because they've got Victor. He can run the lab. They don't need Gale to replace him. And that's what we're thinking. And then Gus walks in.
Right.
And it's pretty creepy the way he is all like professional, and he changes his clothes very slowly and methodically, and he's careful to hang up his tie, and he puts on the lab equipment. You're like, what in the world is he doing? Like, puts on the boots, puts on the gloves, and he doesn't say a word. And the whole time, Walt is pathetically trying to get him to believe, you need us, Gus. Like, you need us. And he's explaining why they had to kill Gale. And he said, what does he say? He says, you kill me, you have nothing. You kill Jesse, you won't have me.
Right. And Jesse looks at Walt right then with a look of like, this is the first time you see a emotional response from Jesse after in this episode, because he actually looks over at Walt at that point.
Interesting.
And you can tell
And
that
what
he
does
was
the
just
look
like,
say?
well, like, hey, thanks, man. Appreciate it. But we're going to die here. But appreciate it type of look.
Huh. So while he is desperate to justify himself before Gus, Gus is just walking up next to Victor with the box cutter in hand and slits his throat in a really gruesome way, so that the blood squirts out all over Jesse and Walt. And then he throws the corpse down so that it'll bleed out in front of Walt and Jesse. And then he walks back over to his clothes and washes his hands and methodically takes off the lab equipment and puts back on his professional attire and walks out. Now, what is he communicating?
Well, he says right before he leaves, he goes, get back to work.
Yeah.
But he is definitely sending a message for sure.
And what is the message?
Well, what is Jesse then later on when Jesse and Walter talking about at the diner, I think Jesse then gives an idea of like, what does that mean? Now, Walt's under the assumption that it's like, well, he's definitely going to be looking for a new cook, and when he does, we're going to die. So what's their plan?
Yeah.
But
what he communicates is, I'm ruthless.
Well, sure.
And you know what was interesting? You know what else I noticed when he was undressing? Gus is kind of buff.
Yeah, he's pretty ripped.
Yeah. In other words, you take off the sort of cheesy, often like yellow Oxford shirt he's wearing that reminds us of like Dwight from The Office. You know, like, don't wear yellow shirts. Like, they just don't look good. You know, mustard color. But you take off that professional Pollos Hermanos manager outfit, and underneath is this guy who's different. Oh, he's actually really ripped. And oh yeah, he's ruthless. He will, he won't hesitate to kill you. And I think that's what he wanted Jesse and Walt to understand. You need to fear me. You don't fear me right now. The way you've been acting, you don't fear me, and you need to fear me. Right now, I think what he was saying in a way was, look, up to this point, we've been working on mutual benefit, right? Like, I pay you, you do this thing, and that's why you do it, because it works out for both of us. Now you're going to do what I ask you to do because I could kill you ruthlessly with my own hands. And so now it's not a mutual incentive, it's fear. I don't think Gus is going to treat them like, professional, we respect each other.
And doesn't he even say earlier on in the show when we first meet Gus is, I don't believe fear to be a good motivator. I think he said that earlier on.
I think you're right. Yeah.
I forget who he was talking about. But if you noticed Mike's response, he pointed the gun at Gus. He didn't even see that coming. There was no communication. Hey, this is what I'm going to do. This was all Gus. And Mike was very taken off guard at that, which was...
When Gus kills Victor, Mike points the gun at Gus?
Right. So he has the gun, and then right when Victor gets his throat cut, he points the gun out of like, whoa, I got a shock. Like, what are you doing? Why would you do that? There was no communication beforehand. He was just in shock as Walt and Jesse were.
Wow, I didn't pick that up. Interesting. Well, I think that it's important. I mean, this is kind of a Machiavellian point, is that it's better to be feared than loved. And we might substitute loved here for respected. Instead of seeing Gus as a guy who can be a mutual, cooperator, business partner, I think Gus says, no, I want you to fear me. And I can rule you better when you fear me. Now, Machiavelli says, it's better to be feared than loved. He says, but you don't want to be hated. A good ruler is one that the ruled fear, but not hated. And I think that Gus is kind of operating in that space where he's still polite and, friendly in a way. He has been, at least. But he's like, get back to work. It's time to work. We're still gonna work together, but you're gonna fear me from here on out.
Right.
Okay, so Walt collects himself, and they've got blood all over themselves, so they have to go to Walmart or someplace and buy some new clothes. Kind of funny, the clothes they wear.
Yeah, they're all oversized, or at least the pants were on Walt.
Yeah, right. Okay, so then they go to Denny's. Jesse and Walt do, and this is, remember, they were talking about going to Denny's back when they were cooking in the desert before their battery runs out.
Yep.
They were going to get some Grand Slams. So they finally get their Grand Slam breakfast, or at least Jesse does. And Jesse is different. As you noted, Jesse was really kind of reserved and traumatized by the murder for the first 90 minutes or 90% of the show. But after he witnesses Gus murder Victor, something changes. Or maybe, I don't know if it's that, or if it's when he sees Walt defend him to Gus and say, you killed Jesse and I won't work for you.
See, I think you see,
I don't know,
the response after when they're putting Victor in the barrel, and Mike's like, is this gonna work? And you finally have a response from Jesse. He says, trust us. But he said it so confidently, and you take that like, trust us. Yeah. But he was just like 5 minutes ago, he was inside himself, like, didn't know what to do. And then he's just like, trust us. Like, that at some point, at that point, when Gus left, he knew that he was safe. And then he turned to self-preservation at that point, like forgetting about what he had to do with Gale, because that was a necessary thing that he had to do. And he kind of accepted it at that point.
Well, whatever it is, he's different, and Walt notices when they're at Denny's.
Right.
And I think it wasn't really evident until that moment, because Jesse is eating food and Walt isn't. And sometimes, when you're really upset, like, you can't eat. And I think that's where Walt is. Walt's just like, he's probably starving because he hasn't eaten anything in a long time, and they've been up, I guess, all night. He should be starving, but he's so disturbed by what's just happened, he can't eat. Whereas Jesse somehow is not disturbed, and he's just scarfing down all this food. And then Walt even asks, what does he say? Like,
what are you doing? I think.
No, he says, are you sure you're okay?
Right.
Or he says something that says, like, you're supposed to, I would expect you to be doing worse than you are. Because he says, how are you doing with the murder? He says, with Gale, the whole thing. And Jesse's like, I'm fine. What do you mean? No big deal. Let's go on. And I forget what he does, but he does something to show that it wasn't a big deal. And Walt is taken aback by that. Like, why isn't it a big deal that you just murdered someone? You just pointed a gun at his face and shot him. Walt's a little disturbed that Jesse isn't more disturbed by it.
Right.
He
but
says,
also, I think
really
it's because he, I think you see just that he really does care for Jesse. That fatherly figure,
right,
approach
comes out,
because he knows that he put Jesse in that position. He was supposed to be the guy that pulls the trigger. Yeah. He's done this before. He's killed people before,
and he still believes he's going to be dying soon, whereas Jesse isn't.
Right.
Okay. Well, I don't know if that is suggesting what's going to happen in the future, but it looks like Jesse is in a different place than he was. we'll have to see what happens next. So then Walt comes back home and he meets Skyler. And I was kind of taken aback by how matter of fact they were. She's not like, where have you been? I was so worried. Like I was doing all these things and you need to tell me. She's just sort of like, oh, yeah, you're back. Okay, well, I moved your car because I didn't want Walter Jr. He's like, oh, yeah, no, of course. He wasn't upset. He's like, yeah, I know, totally get it. The whole relationship was different.
Yeah, I think she's just kind of gotten into the place now where she's tired of saying something and he lies. But he's also at the point now where he just says, you don't want to know. And so I'm guessing she's kind of falling into this normality with these kind of situations because she knows what he does, and therefore these things are going to happen.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're off to an interesting start here with season 4, and it's got to be super awkward in that lab going forward. And I got to say also, I thought it was really weird that Gus killed Victor. I still don't understand why he did that. I get it. I know, to prove a point, to show that he's ruthless. But Gus doesn't have many people that he inherently trusts. And Mike and Victor were the 2 guys that he could trust. And now he just killed one of them. If you want to show that you're ruthless, go kill somebody else. Now, Mike does say, did you let them see you, Victor, at the murder scene?
Right.
But I mean, what does he say? Like, I don't know, something like, I don't know, I'm just another Mexican face or something like that. Like, they're not, the people aren't going to recognize me.
Right. So there's that. And there's the idea, we don't know for certain, but there's the idea of Victor was the one that was supposed to watch over Gale.
He was protecting Gale.
He was protecting Gale, and he failed. And he might be in a position now where someone saw him, so therefore he has to go away.
I get it, but the guy just proved his worth in the lab. I mean, it just, man, I don't know. Gus really is a ruthless guy. He doesn't he doesn't allow for any mistakes, except of course when Walt's making them. But Walt has, kind of performed well. Like he's shown that he can play the game and beat Gus, and in a pretty serious way. So, but like I said, it's going to be super awkward in that lab going forward because nobody trusts anybody except Jesse and Walt.
Right. They're probably at a good spot, the 2 of them, with how they feel about each other.
Yeah. If I were them, though, I'd be looking for an exit plan with Gus and saying, hey, we talked about doing 6 months or whatever, but let's just agree to disagree here, or to pull out of the contract and just make it 1 more month or something like that. I mean, like they ought to be looking for an easy off ramp with each other. And then, I don't know, if I were Walt or Jesse, I'm probably going to be looking for some place in Costa Rica to live or something to get out of the way.
Yeah, well, we'll see, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe. You could find these episodes on Apple Podcast and YouTube, and you could follow and also contact us on Twitter and Patreon at Breaking Into BB. We will see you next time as we break into another episode of Breaking Bad.